and we're going to review a case study that I conducted late last year, and we're going to take a good look at the results of that study and the return on investment for implementing asset management in that particular environment. A lot of these pieces that we're going to look at are quite universal. I've been seeing them for years across different verticals, different customer types. So yeah, let's get started here. So for those of you who have joined our webinars before, and mine in particular, welcome back. And to folks who are new on the phone, just a quick introduction. My name is Paul Manfredi. I'm a senior systems engineer here at Intuitive Technologies. I've been in the Altiris space for over 12 years now. Been doing implementation since late 2006. Been an instructor for Symantec, for a couple of Symantec partners, and so far I estimate probably around 70 Altiris projects from the 6.0 days to present. With me today I have Mike Dunham, our team manager at Intuitive, and Mike's going to give you a quick overview of Intuitive, who we are as a company, and how we can help you. Mike, I'll kick it over to you for a minute or so.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate everybody's time today. It looks like we've got a good audience. So please, as we go forward with the conversation, please send questions in through the chat, and we'll do our level best to get through as many as we can at the end. But I also just wanted to highlight Paul is recognized internationally as a particular specialist on the asset management products within Altiris. He's got experience across the entire group of products, but he's been able to identify millions of dollars worth of savings for many of our clients. And we felt that this would really be a great opportunity for our customers to see some of the things that he can do, and hopefully glean some good tips for things that you might be able to do right now, just based off this discussion of where he was able to find savings for a particular client. A little bit about Intuitive. We are an employee-owned company. We are an ESOP is what the definition is for it, but more importantly, it means that our employees are very vested in the success of the company as well as our clients, and we're pretty proud of that. In addition to that, we have a number of different areas we focus on. We do a lot of big data consulting. We are very heavy into lean, agile coaching and business process. And we have a very strong DevOps presence. And that really has grown from the roots of Intuitive, which is IT systems management. And we, as Paul mentioned, we've been an Altiris partner for many years. I personally was one of the original Altiris employees and had a chance to work for Altiris for 7 years as an engineer. So I certainly had a chance to witness Paul's expertise early on. So I'm really pleased to announce this webinar today, and look forward to seeing all that Paul can share with you today.
Thanks, Mike. So here's today's agenda. Introduction we've just gotten through. We're going to look at the customer profile a little bit to understand what the customer looks like that we looked at here, that we're going to look at here in today's webinar. After that, we're going to take a brief look at the asset management program. I call it program because what we're doing here with Altiris Asset Management Suite is we're marrying the processes and the actual ins and outs, or the way that we need to follow and be structured to be successful, we're taking those pieces, those process, whether it be software or hardware or contract management workflows, and I can show you a couple examples of those. And we're integrating that into the product, where we're going to leverage and extend the CMDB. One of the best parts about working with Altiris Asset Management is that extensibility around the CMDB and how we can tailor it to each customer's needs. So after that, we're going to look at, I'm going to bring up a Word document, the actual assessment report that was submitted to the customer. And we're going to go through that in some detail and understand in the space of, I think, roughly 5 days on site, after meeting with the customer, we understood real quick where the value is for them in going with the asset management suite. And once we've conducted the review of the case study, we're going to open it up to discussion and Q&A, and then we'll hit next steps. Okay, so the customer we're talking about here is a multinational retail customer. They're quite a large corporation here in the U.S., spread across the U.S., both on a business-to-business line, retail stores, as well as overseas, growing presence in Europe, Canada, Mexico. They're comprised of roughly, and that rate of growth has really exponentially taken off for them in the last 10 years. They've acquired roughly 10 competitive companies, and they've really been successful in their space. And with that success comes some challenges, obviously, and those challenges are in that field of IT systems management, and that holistic view of making sure that their liabilities are mitigated around software license management, data breaches, IT governance of their assets, and so on. They currently are roughly at a 40,000 endpoint count, and that number is expected to go up again this year. So the way things have generally gone there is, once a company is acquired, it's integrated into the larger network to a degree, and we'll take a look at that in more detail in the report here coming up. They are currently at the corporate level an Altiris customer. They're using our CMS solution suite, so they're doing things like inventory software management, patch management, and so on. This is one of their core products that get implemented rather quickly into each of the integrated or acquired networks that are part of their acquisition of the new companies. And they're primarily leasing their equipment for the majority of assets in North America. So a quick overview of planning for a successful asset management program. For those of you that are not familiar, intimately familiar with what makes up the asset management suite, I put together a quick graphic here that we could go through. So at the core of it is the notification server, and that's where we'd have our asset management solution, the CMDB, so the database, ancillary solutions such as barcode solution or barcode essentials that we're using now on the iOS devices, some reporting and analytics tool sets from IT Analytics, as well as our solution set, inventory, as well as data connector. So if we start up here we leverage the external or the on-site email environment for our notifications. So any sort of notification, contract is due, a lease is up, all those types of email notifications, reporting, all those sorts of things. The actual database being on the back end can be either on or off box. So the back end of our solution is a SQL database. The asset reports, again, coming out of the SQL database, that's primarily consumed by the project stakeholders, the user community, and facilitated by an asset manager role. One of our primary import tools is Active Directory. So we leverage things like users, subnets, sites, departments, all the information that we can glean from Active Directory is used. Down here, again, there's a third-party app called Barcode Essentials, which runs on iOS devices. And the primary use for that is hardware asset receiving, physical inventory, move add changes, that sort of thing. So that's a very quick and easy way for the field techs, for example, to keep assets up to date and to follow the processes that are put in place. Just above that here, we have an example of a managed endpoint. So we have an agent running on those endpoints that collects hardware, software inventory, and does all kinds of things, but for the purposes of our conversation, collects that inventory and forwards it to the notification server, where it's then housed in the database and we can report on it. Data connector imports, we can also do exports, but our primary usage of data connector is to connect to other systems. So be it accounting, so SAP, Oracle, your PeopleSoft, all the different either financial or vendor data imports. So what we typically like to use here up front for a hardware implementation of asset management is we leverage vendor sales reports a lot of the times. And the reason why we do that is because we use them to create shell records that we can receive against. And the idea behind that is we're building, we're layering on information onto that asset as it cycles or iterates through its active and then disposal through its life cycle, essentially. And last up here, we have our workflow server solution. So as the process matures a little bit and we can look for automation gains, so we can remove some of the mundane. Once we typically will leverage workflow once we're comfortable with the manual processes being vetted out and proven in the environment. So some high-level steps here to a successful implementation. So each one of these main bullet points essentially is a project phase, and I've tried to keep it as high level as possible in the interest of time. But essentially, phase one, we gather business requirements and conduct that assessment to understand our initial standing. So things like stakeholder interviews, identifying risk metrics to the project to its success, analyzing any analytics reporting needs from the stakeholders and the business. Then we conduct asset lifecycle workshop meetings, whiteboard sessions. What I'm trying to get at this phase is the creation of detailed business requirements from the customer. I can come in with best practice and my take on it, but I always like to make sure that the customer gets exactly what they're looking for, because I can tailor the solution essentially to their exact needs. The next phase then will create a design lifecycle build, essentially documentation. So here's where I would document process on each lifecycle phase, document the design of the resource model. So I have a couple of examples here I just wanted to pop up. So here's the first one where I would document the data flow. So these would be all my data sources down here, SolarWinds and database, telecom information, Cisco. These are all data sources. They would all be leveraged. These are all my data connector solution pieces where I would bring those data sources in. They would get normalized and then brought into the Altair CMDB. In this particular example, we're leveraging RemedyForce service management as an output. So the help desk folks can get a full pane of information on any of the assets in scope. Another example of documentation produced, this essentially, I know it's not really important that you can read each one of them, but the idea here is that this is a resource model, and each one of these is actually a resource. So here's a resource with its data classes and data attributes, and the lines are the relationships between those. So in essence, I try to leave a picture of the database, which makes reporting a lot easier, which makes which makes the process a little bit easier to follow because you understand where everything is connected. So example down here, if I just zoom in a little bit, I've got a example of a telecom circuit, and that inherits all the attributes from an asset. So I don't want to get down too low in the weeds here, but I just wanted to give you an example of what it looks like and the kind of things you can expect from an implementation. So that's the design phase. The next phase then would be testing and pilot of the deployment. So the actual installation, configuration, implementation of the solution. Pilot out those hardware and software tracking configs. And then once the folks have an idea of what it looks like, we can hone in a little bit more on reporting requirements, things like application metering to understand things like when software is being used, so we can maybe harvest some of that software and reduce those software asset costs also. Next up, we test custom resource configs, and it's basically testing after that. And then finally, we go live with our production deployment. So again, a configuration walkthrough, and then finalize internal documentation. Typically there's a lot of process and procedural documentation here, as well as transfer of the ownership of the platform. So that's what it looks like for a successful implementation. So let's take a look now at the actual case study that we conducted. Oh, sorry about that. Get that case study up here. Okay. So the way this case study, the way this assessment report, I should say, breaks down is we have two main goals here. The first is to review and assess the environment and help the client understand the roadmap of where we want to go. So that leads us into the second piece. So first piece, assessment against best practices to give them an understanding of where they currently stand as far as their asset management program goes. Again, the second one being that high-level action plan and roadmap of the steps necessary to implement and get to where they need to be. Essentially, assessing addressing the gaps. So it breaks down into our gap analysis breaks down into analysis recommendations.
Hey, Paul, sorry
Yep.
to interrupt you. We can't see the document.
Oh. You don't see it at all, Mike?
No, we just see your presentation, case study review.
Okay, that's odd. Let me try that again. How's that, Mike?
There we go.
Okay. So these are the two areas of focus. So and here's how the gap analysis breaks down. So analysis recommendations, and then again our roadmap approach, and then really detailing the interviews with the stakeholders. Get down to the meat of it here in a second. So one of the processes that we focused on at this particular customer. Let me see if I can just make that a little wider. Was the end of lease process. So right off the bat, this customer really is tracking their entire corporate IT asset. All of their IT assets were tracked through spreadsheets. A lot of that led us really quickly to understand the gap between where assets belonged at the end of their lease, where they were located, and really the gap of lack of visibility of those assets. So the savings, the initial savings that I wanted to show you down here was the assets were unable to be recovered. They were a little bit better at the corporate head office, but as soon as you branched away from there to retail outlets, distribution centers, that sort of thing, they really didn't have a lot of visibility into it, and that really translated into a loss of capital for them, because the assets were coming due end of lease, but because the assets were unable to be tracked down and returned, those lease payments continue. So we did some quick math there and came up with a relatively conservative number of $500,000 just on these assets that were not found in the environment and continue to have lease payments sent as bills to the customer. So that was one of the big ones. The next one over here was from a security standpoint, the gap here was that they didn't have the ability to definitively say when a 0-day patch needed to be released, what the active machines in their environment were. And that really was a huge catalyst for this project, because a couple of the recent viruses came out and IT couldn't tell upper management that the environment was secure because they couldn't tell if those assets were effectively on the network or not. We had things like last check-in date and things like pinging, but there was no, because there was a complete lack of governance of those assets, we couldn't, or the internal teams really couldn't put a good number on which machines were active on the environment. as far as resources go, believe it or not, an environment that size, there was no dedicated asset manager or software asset manager for that point. So one of our recommendations was to bring in someone dedicated to the role. Again, software licensing, no program in place, and we'll look at that a little bit lower down. So no harvesting of software licenses, any of that sort of thing. So, and I've quantified that a little bit lower also. So as a result, like I was saying, that end of lease team, and that is a sizable team. There were 4 resources working against getting those assets returned end of lease, and even with that, the range was somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 annually. Again, we talked about that threat of malware, inability to understand where the assets were located, the software asset tracking. So typical example of software asset, the specific use case was worth noting. So anytime a project was brought in, a new project was spun up, point products such as Visio or Project were purchased, Acrobat, that sort of thing. They were installed on the machines, and when the project spun down or when the laptop was returned to the IT team, the licenses disappeared with the reinstallation of the laptop. So each time a new software or service management request came in for one of those pieces of software, to make sure they were compliant, they had to pay for a new license. And we did some metrics around how many purchases they did, and just for those 2 point products, we came to $100,000, which was a little bit unbelievable, but was the case. So let's take a look a little bit further down here at the gap analysis. So along with that, the main reviews that were done were as I mentioned, the computer desktop hardware procurement process, the hardware refresh and forecasting. So because of this was another big one, because they couldn't understand how many machines were due for refresh or end of lease. They didn't have accurate enough numbers other than what the lessor would provide to them. So they were basing all their purchase and all their refresh forecasts budgeting based on the lessor instead of understanding their environment. So we reviewed that one. Software procurement and entitlement, I just mentioned. The retirement and lease return, that was the big one. And then the leased assets, the tracking that I just mentioned. So as far as the business objectives go, we put that roadmap together, but here are the main points that we wanted to hit as far as business objectives with our implementation. So things like ensure the accuracy of the information, ensure efficient lifecycle management, align the assets to those vulnerabilities, avoid asset loss, improve those planning capabilities. So they're all about the benefits that you incur when you have visibility into your assets. This particular environment had no visibility into computer assets until the asset went active, meaning until an agent checked into the Altiris notification server for the first time. And if it hadn't checked in, I think their check-in purging maintenance was set to 60 days. So if the machine wasn't seen on the network by our notification server after 60 days, they would essentially go into retired mode. So it was basically an on or off. It was active or it was retired. There was no in stock, on order, received, and then on the other end there was no disposed, there was no location, no governance whatsoever around that asset as far as location, ownership, cost center, department, any of those things. So by implementing those measures and bringing that in, we could ensure proper chargeback if that's part of the model. I've done lots of these, a lot of these implementations where IT actually owns the entire asset budget for IT assets and charges back departments individually. Now we can enable software license compliance, license harvesting, ensure that we can pass an audit where we're able to understand not only which machine has the software installed on it and when it was used last, but what purchase order was used to pay for that license. And that's critical when auditors come around. So here's our gaps and recommendations table. So a lot of these were very broad as far as, you know, the main one, day one, there was no formal hardware asset management program in place. There was no software asset management program in place. I mean, there are initiatives, there are stopgap measures to try to understand what's out there, but the overarching asset management program was nowhere to be found. Also around procurement, there was no mechanism to create those shell asset records, so that was one of our main best practice recommendations there. Again, the security patch, that inability to determine if a computer asset is currently in use and active on the network was a big one, and that was as much from an asset management perspective as it was from a IT security standpoint to address vulnerabilities. Lease contracts, so there was no practice to proactively track computer leases in a centralized manner other than a spreadsheet. So that was something that we can do quite easily with a lease schedule, where the lease schedule essentially builds out a contract with start and end dates, and we assign serial numbers to that. So then we can build notifications around those contract end dates that'll easily help decision makers understand and be able to start planning and forecasting their needs 60, 90, 180 days out, whatever the case may be. Uniformed organizational data was another big one, where locations were called something different. You know, the same location had 3 different names depending on who named it. So that lack of uniformity really hurts when you try to implement a CMDB. And then build out some stock rooms to understand where your assets are, either disposition or newly received assets. So that all has to be built out into a logical stock room. Some additional gaps. I mean, there were quite a few here. Stock levels, so we can create automated reorder thresholds when we have those stock levels in place. Server assets were not being collected. Again, as I mentioned, the active status only as far as asset lifecycle goes, so complete lack of visibility there. Telephony assets, network assets not being tracked. The lack of a centralized hardware and software maintenance contract repository, which we use as warranty contract in Altiris. So we leverage warranty contracts to take care of, and that can be any type of hardware. It doesn't have to be IT. I've done everything from cash registers to mechanical fleet assets. Mobility assets were not being tracked in any way, so everyone's mobility devices were not tracked at all, which is a giant gap also from both a leakage point of view and data vulnerability point of view. Again, the end of lease notification on leased assets. And lastly, no process or platform to associate those assets. So there was no connectivity between assets. Example, server to a rack, a blade to a chassis, computer to a monitor, that sort of thing. So the second part of the report focused on, well, what are we going to do about this now? What's our plan? So we developed an action plan and an implementation roadmap that provided a breakdown. So any asset management project that I'll implement, I break it down into project objectives and milestones. So I just put out a list of gap analysis and change management, all the objectives that we would want to come across and meet as part of a successful implementation of asset. So everything from that design phase full through to testing, cutover, training, integration of the tool, the financial piece. If some companies still want to use depreciation schedules in asset management, which is great. Disposal, end of life management, again, contract management that we talked about a minute ago, software discovery, and then barcoding. Barcoding is a really good one for the hardware asset environment, as well as doing things like those annual physical inventory audits in the environment. And the objectives, the last objectives, reporting, analytics, and then, like as I mentioned earlier on, where we can leverage automation and take a little bit back as far as manual tasks go. And then the milestones. So similar to what I showed you earlier, our milestones: build out that plan, complete the analysis, complete the build, document the strategy, pilot, understand the reporting metrics, external data integration, and data migration. So here's our second piece of it, which is our action plan. So this particular customer, they have 3 separate Altiris environments, and each one of those environments manages a certain number of those subsidiaries. So if we just looked at phase one, we broke it out into 5 different parts. So if we take a look at those different parts, the first part would be that assess, design, implement asset management on those computer, desktop, and software assets. So things like the CMDB bill, the model that I showed you, the structural import activities, warranty, lease, software, and reporting. And then we'd focus in the second part of this implementation. What we did was we focused on the non-managed assets. So non-managed assets to us means anything that we're unable to put an agent on, essentially. So docking station, a projector, flat panels in conference rooms, things like that. So again, extending out what we did in phase 1 into phase 2. And then subsequent phases, so part 3, we'd focus on network and storage assets. So leveraging things like our network discovery and SNMP, agentless inventory, we would focus on bringing in through a combination of SNMP agentless inventory and even SolarWinds or Cisco or whoever the data source is, as long as we have that common resource key that we can key off to associate the attributes to the asset, we're good. So next up is server assets, design and build. So again, just extending out what we did in the first 3 phases to the server assets, and then finally looking at that process automation. So where are we going to take it, and where are we going to look for those gains in automation? So that's an example of what we do as far as that assessment goes, and our mindset around the implementation of the program, and it's quite typical as far as the ROI goes. We see this in quite a few different environments, as I mentioned. So there's a lot of gain to be had here from the implementation of Asset Management Suite. So with that, I will let's kick it back to open us up for comments and questions. I know I went through a lot of material. I wanted to make sure that I got everything covered. I'm going to open up the panel here for everyone to chime in. If you just bear with me 1 second.
So it looks like there are a fair number of questions. If you want to continue to post those into the chat, we'll handle them, as many as we can get through. But I do have a few that have already shown up, and it looks
everyone should be off mute now. Sorry, Mike. I just want to make sure everyone had a chance to chime in either via chat or over the phone. So yeah, please go ahead.
So I had the question, you had a bunch of items that look like individual work items as a bullet point. Did you record this webinar, and can I get a copy of the presentation? And as a follow-up, how can I prioritize those bullets to get the most value? Which of those seem to be the most valuable, I guess, is what he's getting at.
Okay, so the answer to the recording part, absolutely. We always record our webinars, and we make them available. I can either send it directly out to you, or via our page. Our page either on YouTube or LinkedIn. So yes, it's recorded. As far as prioritizing the assets to gain the most value, this particular assessment report was geared that way. So they are geared in a value-oriented manner to provide the most value. We see the most value typically in the desktop software asset space. Immediately behind that is server licensing. I can't stress that enough. There are some server environments where you know, the contracts are so convoluted that we're typically over licensed by an incredible amount. You know, names like Oracle and IBM are first to come to mind. So I'll make it available, and yeah, if you look at the video, it is prioritized. So my answer to that would be take your desktop environment first, and then focus on servers.
Great. I think this question ties right into that. It said, what assets beyond the computers and the software do you typically recommend for quick gains?
So again, yeah, the quickest gains, if you're an existing Altiris environment, the quickest and easiest are the desktops. Are your desktop computing environment, your end user computing environment, the hardware, and then the software that goes along with them.
And I'll just ask this one. I know you've done a number of implementations for other customers. What are some of the additional devices that they go after? I know I've seen customers that do cell phones or printers, or what are some of the higher value things that you've seen tracked beyond that?
Mobile assets are making a surge. So we work a lot with the mobile management tools to bring in across actually a sum between the tool sets, so the mobile management tool sets, and the providers' data sources. But I would say mobility is the number one asset type at the top of the list of non-managed assets.
Okay. There's another one. Paul mentioned something about barcode scanning. Is there an additional add-in to the console, and what devices work well with those?
Yeah, that's a great question. I covered it very briefly, but there's a third-party app called Barcode Essentials, and you can reach out to one of our sales reps that can give you more information around that. And it's really there are two pieces to this. There's a piece that is certified that plugs right into the SMP environment, and the other part of it is an app on your iOS device. They're currently only supporting iOS devices, so you can use an iPad or an iPhone, and it leverages the iPhone's camera to take pictures of the barcode and transcribe that barcode into its interface locally. It connects via the wireless, the corporate wireless, or you can synchronize it. You can synchronize it once you have access. There was an old tool that was called Barcode Solutions that this was essentially replaced now. It works very well. It's very quick. It's not too expensive, and the gains are phenomenal compared to the price points of these things. So I did one implementation where they were roughly receiving 1,000 assets a month into the stockroom. So we used iPad minis coupled via Bluetooth with a small barcode scanner, and the efficiency, once the labels were affixed to the assets and we had those shell records created, it was very quick to physically as well as logically receive those assets into our inventory.
Okay, here's one that's sort of in that same vein. How low of a value would you go to in determining disposables versus managed assets? For example, mouse versus keyboard versus monitor. What's a good point to start?
So, yeah, that's a good question. Ultimately, it's up to the customer, but as a rule of thumb, we typically go with $150 to $200 value and a serial number. If it meets those criteria, I'll ask the question, because a lot of monitors now are in that price range. It used to be that we would always track monitors, but as the price point has come down, they've taken on more of a consumable standpoint. But ultimately, it's your call in your particular environment.
Okay. Here's a good one. How do you determine who owns licenses when you start this process? It looks like a nightmare getting details from my purchasing department as to who actually bought it.
Don't be don't be alarmed. It's always a nightmare. It really comes, as long as you can establish an initial count of assets that tie back to a PO, it makes it a little bit easier as a start point. And again, it depends on the software, because some software is going to be serialized and affixed to a user, whereas others, you'll get a pool of licenses and it's just a per user count. So there are some nuances there that need to be followed, but yeah, I mean, it's software is always going to be a little bit tougher to get out of the gate. A lot of times we'll go back 3 years. I'll ask a customer to bring us at least 3 years of historical software purchases to use as our start point.
Okay. Here's one that might be a little bit too big for this conversation, but I'll bring it up. Says, can you talk about how you quantify the risk for the security risks you talked about, a 0-day patch, for example? Assuming that getting at the value of the risk.
Quantify and well, I mean, that the damage that could be incurred, being on the homepage of USA Today, where you're the next Home Depot and you got hacked, it's hard to put a number on it. Nobody wants that press.
Sure.
It's hard to quantify, but it's damaging, to say the least.
Sure. Well, I thought it was interesting personally when I saw that one, was that is tied to asset management and could potentially help fund asset projects out of a security thing. So it was interesting to see that.
Yeah, and it has, because when a CISO reads that a major company was hacked and credit cards were taken, things like that, you have to look at your environment to understand where your vulnerabilities are, and this just happened to be a major one. Not knowing where your assets are is a security risk in itself.
Excellent point. That looks like all the questions I have received, and so I would make a last call for additional questions from the participants.
Okay, well, one last note I had here was that if anyone is interested in a complimentary assessment of their asset environment, just reach out to me. My email address is up on the screen right now. I can definitely help you out with that. All right. If we have nothing further, I think we'll go ahead and call it.
Well, thank you, Paul. This was a great presentation. I know it was valuable for me, and based on the comments, it sounds like it was valuable to a lot of our participants as well. So thanks, everybody, for your time today, and thank you, Paul.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Bye.